She was, for the better part of 2 decades, the most hated woman in Britain. Not disliked, not controversial, hated. Her name was a punchline on late-night television. Strangers threw bread rolls at her in a supermarket. Newspapers called her the third person in a royal marriage, the woman who broke the heart of the most beloved princess the world had ever seen. If you had stopped anyone on a London street in the year 1997 and asked them who Camilla Parker Bowles was, they would have given you one answer, and it would not have been a kind one. She was the villain, the other woman, the face of everything that had gone wrong inside the House of Windsor. And yet, on the 6th of May, in the year 2023, that same woman sat inside Westminster Abbey, beneath the same vaulted ceilings where monarchs have been crowned for nearly 1,000 years, and the Archbishop of Canterbury lowered a crown onto her head. Not a consort's afterthought, a crown. The world watched as Camilla was anointed queen. The woman Britain had spent 30 years despising had, without ever seeming to fight for it, without ever seeming to reach for it, quietly taken the highest position a woman can hold in the British monarchy. A throne that no one, at any point, had ever promised her. A throne that public opinion had, for decades, sworn she would never be allowed near. So how did she do it? How does the most hated woman in a nation erase that hatred so completely that the country stands and watches her crowned? This is not a story about scandal, though there was plenty of scandal. This is a story about patience, about playing games so long, so quietly, and so precisely that by the time everyone realized what was happening, it was already done. Stay with me, because the way Camilla rewrote her own story is one of the most extraordinary reversals in modern royal history, and almost nobody understands how it actually happened. To understand the scale of what she pulled off, you have to go back to the beginning, and the beginning is not the beginning most people think. Camilla and Charles did not meet as strangers who fell into an affair years into his marriage. They met long before Diana ever entered the picture. It was the early 1970s. Charles was a young naval officer, the heir to the throne, and Camilla Shan was a sharp, funny, confident young woman who was, by every account, completely unbothered by his status. That was the thing about her. She did not treat him like a prince. She treated him like a person. And for a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by people bowing and scraping, that was intoxicating. They were, by most accounts, genuinely in love. But the timing was wrong and the rules were unforgiving. Charles went off to serve in the Navy, and while he was away, Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles, a dashing cavalry officer she had known for years. The window had closed. Charles, the heir to a throne, was expected to marry a very particular kind of woman, young, aristocratic, and crucially, with no romantic history that could ever embarrass the crown. Camilla, now a married woman, did not fit that mold anymore. And so the two of them went their separate ways, at least officially, and Charles began the long, strange search for a bride who would satisfy the palace, the press, and the public. But here is the detail that so many people forget. The connection between Charles and Camilla never truly died. It went quiet, it went underground, but it endured through the years, through his search for a wife, through the pageantry of what was about to become the most famous wedding of the century. And that enduring bond, that refusal of two people to let go of one another, is the thread that runs through this entire story. It is the reason for the tragedy that followed. And, strange as it sounds, it is also the reason the ending would eventually make a kind of sense. Because whatever else you believe about Camilla, one thing is difficult to deny. She was constant. Through decades of scandal and humiliation, through public loathing that would have crushed almost anyone, she never let go. That constancy would eventually become the very foundation on which she rebuilt everything. That search ended with a 19-year-old named Diana Spencer. And here is where the story turns into a tragedy, because the marriage that the entire world celebrated as a fairy tale was, according to the accounts of nearly everyone involved, built on a fault line from the very first day. Diana was young, luminous, and adored by the public in a way no royal had been in living memory. But behind the palace walls, she felt like an outsider in her own marriage. And the reason, the presence she could never quite escape, had a name. Camilla. Diana would later put it in words that the entire world would remember. In a television interview watched by millions, she looked into the camera and said there were 3 people in her marriage, so it was a bit crowded. She did not need to say the third name. Everyone already knew it. And in that single sentence, Camilla was cast, permanently it seemed, as the woman who had stolen a nation's princess's husband. The other woman, the intruder, the villain of the fairy tale. The years that followed became known, inside the press and the palace alike, as the War of the Waleses. It was a slow, agonizing public collapse of a marriage, played out across newspaper front pages and television specials. Both sides had their allies. Both sides had their leaks, and the public, hungry for every detail, watched a royal marriage disintegrate in real time. But in the court of public opinion, the verdict was never really in doubt. Diana was the wronged party, the young bride who had been let down, and Camilla was the reason. She became the single figure onto whom the entire nation could pour its sympathy for Diana and its anger at the institution that had failed her. Every tear the public shed for the princess became another mark against the woman they blamed for her unhappiness. But the moment that truly sealed Camilla's reputation was not a careful interview. It was something far more humiliating. In the early 1990s, a private telephone conversation between Charles and Camilla was intercepted and leaked to the press. The contents were intimate, deeply, embarrassingly intimate. The tabloids printed every word and the nation devoured it. Overnight, the affair was no longer a rumor or an accusation. It was documented, recorded, splashed across every front page in the country. The press gave it a name, a nickname that turned a private humiliation into a national joke. And Camilla became, in an instant, the most mocked woman in Britain. Think about what that means. Not just hated, but ridiculed. Her private life stripped bare and served up as entertainment. She could not go to the shops without being recognized. She could not walk down a street without whispers. On one occasion, she was reportedly pelted with bread rolls by other shoppers who recognized her. This was not a woman with a public relations problem. This was a woman whose reputation had been detonated at ground level in front of the entire world with no obvious path back. And it is worth pausing to understand just how total that humiliation was, because it explains why what came later is so extraordinary. In the age before the internet, before social media, the tabloid press held a power over public reputation that is difficult to imagine today. A single front page could reach into millions of homes and set the tone for how an entire nation thought about a person. And the press had decided, with unanimous cruelty, what Camilla was. She was the villain, and they would remind the country of it every single day. There was no platform on which she could defend herself. There was no counter-narrative she could offer. The story had been written, printed, and burned into the national consciousness, and she was trapped inside it with no visible way out. Most people, faced with that, would have retreated from public life forever, and for a time, that is very nearly what she did. And then, in the summer of 1997, the situation went from catastrophic to seemingly unsalvageable. Diana died in a car crash in Paris, and the grief that swept across Britain and the world was unlike anything the monarchy had ever witnessed. Millions mourned. An ocean of flowers piled up outside the palace gates, and in that moment of raw national heartbreak, the public did not just mourn Diana. They looked for someone to blame, and the woman standing at the center of that blame, fairly or not, was Camilla Parker Bowles. If you had told anyone in September of 1997 that this woman would one day be crowned Queen of the United Kingdom, they would have laughed in your face. It was, at that moment, one of the most impossible ideas imaginable. The public would never accept it. The press would never allow it. The very notion was a fantasy. And this is exactly where the genius of what came next begins. Because Camilla did not fight the tide. She did not go on television to defend herself. She did not give tearful interviews or hire loud publicists to argue her case. She did something far more powerful and far more patient. She disappeared. She went quiet. She let the storm rage and she waited for it to pass. Behind the scenes, though, a plan was taking shape. Charles was determined that the woman he loved would one day be accepted, and he brought in a communications strategist named Mark Bolland to make it happen. What followed was one of the most methodical reputation campaigns in modern history. It was so deliberate, so carefully staged, that insiders later gave it a nickname. They called it Operation Parker Bowles. The mission was simple to state and almost impossible to achieve. Take the most hated woman in Britain and, inch by inch, make the public accept her. The strategy was patience disguised as passivity. There would be no grand announcements, no demands. Instead, Camilla would be introduced to the public in the smallest possible doses, so gradually that the resistance would soften before anyone realized it was softening. The first real move came in 1999. Charles and Camilla left a private party at the Ritz Hotel in London, and for the first time, they allowed themselves to be photographed together in public. It was a fleeting moment, a few steps, a wall of cameras. But it was calculated to the second. It told the public a simple message without saying a word. We are together, and we are not hiding anymore. From there, the campaign moved at a glacial, deliberate pace. Camilla appeared at a charity event here, a public function there, always dignified, always quiet, never demanding attention, never seeking the spotlight, never putting a foot wrong. Where Diana had dazzled with charisma and vulnerability, Camilla did the opposite. She offered steadiness, reliability, the complete absence of drama. And slowly, so slowly that it was almost impossible to notice, the public began to grow used to her. Familiarity, it turned out, was the antidote to hatred. The more people saw her simply existing, calmly, without scandal, the harder it became to sustain the fury. A crucial milestone came in 2000, when Camilla was quietly introduced to Queen Elizabeth II at a birthday party. For the reigning monarch, the guardian of the institution itself, to acknowledge Camilla's presence was an enormous signal. It told the establishment and the press that the highest authority in the land was not standing in the way. The door, once bolted shut, had been unlocked. But there was another obstacle, and it was a far more delicate one than public opinion. There were two young men whose feelings on the matter carried a weight no strategist could manufacture. William and Harry, Diana's sons. For Camilla to ever be accepted, she could not be seen to be pushing her way into their lives, replacing the mother the world had mourned. This was handled with the same patience as everything else. Introductions were made privately, on the boys' terms, without cameras and without fanfare. There was no attempt to force a bond, no staged photographs of a happy, blended family. It was allowed to develop, or not, in its own time and away from the public eye. And that restraint, that refusal to exploit the most emotionally charged relationship of the entire saga, was itself a kind of strategy. It signaled respect. It signaled that Camilla understood there were lines that could not be crossed. Slowly, the appearances grew more frequent and more public. She stood among the royals at national occasions. She was present, though carefully in the background, at the Queen's Golden Jubilee in 2002, a moment of national celebration where the crowds cheered the monarchy and, almost imperceptibly, began to accept the woman standing quietly at the edge of the family. Each of these appearances was a small deposit in a long, patient account. None of them made headlines on their own, but together, over years, they accumulated into something powerful. They made Camilla familiar. And familiarity, as the strategists understood, was the slow poison that would eventually kill the hatred. Then, in 2005, came the moment that would have seemed unthinkable just 8 years earlier. Charles and Camilla married. But even here, notice the precision, the care, the strategic restraint. They did not marry in a grand cathedral spectacle. It was a civil ceremony, followed by a blessing. And most tellingly of all, Camilla did not take the title everyone expected. She did not become the Princess of Wales. That title belonged, in the public's heart, to Diana, and to claim it would have reopened every wound at once. Instead, she took a quieter title, the Duchess of Cornwall. It was a small choice, but it was a masterstroke. It signaled humility. It signaled that she knew her place in the public's memory and would not overreach. And the public, watching, noticed. Every choice in that period followed the same logic. Take less than people expect. Claim nothing that could provoke the old anger. Let the public feel that she knew exactly where she stood in their memory and that she had no intention of overstepping it. It was, in a sense, a lesson in the power of restraint. In a world where everyone shouts to be heard, Camilla whispered. And somehow that whisper carried further than any shout ever could. This is the part of the story that so few people appreciate. For nearly 2 decades after that marriage, Camilla simply worked. She took on charitable causes, many of them difficult, unglamorous ones. She championed campaigns against domestic violence and sexual assault. She promoted literacy and supported the elderly. She showed up, year after year, to the kind of events that generate no headlines and win no adoring crowds. She did the quiet, grinding, unspectacular work of a royal, and she did it without complaint and without seeking praise. And in doing so, she slowly, steadily rewrote the story the public told about her. She was no longer only the other woman. She was becoming something else, reliable, dignified, even to some, likable. The transformation was so gradual that most people never registered it happening. There was no single dramatic turning point, no viral moment of redemption. Instead, there were 1,000 tiny moments, each one nudging public opinion a fraction of a degree, until one day the country looked up and realized that the woman it had once despised had somehow become a fixture, a steady presence at the side of the future king, and the old fury had simply burned itself out. And then came the moment that sealed everything, and it came from the one person whose word on the matter was final. In February of 2022, as she marked 70 years on the throne, Queen Elizabeth II released a written message to the nation, and in it, she said something that changed everything. She stated that it was her sincere wish that, when the time came, Camilla would be known as Queen Consort. Read that again. The most respected woman in the world. The monarch, who had reigned for 70 years, the ultimate guardian of the crown's dignity, personally and publicly, gave Camilla her blessing to become queen. In one sentence, decades of doubt were swept away. The debate was over. If the queen wanted it, no one could argue. It was, in every sense, the final seal on a campaign that had lasted more than 20 years. The woman who had been pelted with bread rolls, mocked on every front page, blamed by a grieving nation, had just been personally endorsed by Queen Elizabeth herself to wear a crown. When Elizabeth died in September of 2022 and Charles became king, the path was clear. Camilla became Queen Consort, and before long, the qualifier fell away, and she was known simply as Queen. And on that day in May of 2023, inside Westminster Abbey, The transformation was completed in gold and jewels and ancient ceremony. Camilla was crowned queen, standing beside the king, in front of a watching world that had, almost without noticing, come to accept the impossible. Consider the sheer weight of that scene for a moment. The same Westminster Abbey where kings and queens had been crowned for centuries. The same institution that had once regarded Camilla as an impossibility, a scandal too great to ever overcome. The crowds outside were not throwing bread rolls now. They were waving flags. The front pages that had once mocked her mercilessly now carried photographs of her in a crown, described her robes, catalogued the jewels. The entire apparatus of the British establishment, the press, the church, the state, had swung fully behind the very woman it had once treated as beyond redemption. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the most complete reversals of fortune in the modern history of any public figure anywhere in the world. So what is the real lesson of this astonishing reversal? Because, make no mistake, it is astonishing. Reputations, once destroyed on this scale, almost never recover. The graveyard of public life is full of people who were far less hated than Camilla was in 1997 and who never climbed back. So how did she do what should have been impossible? The answer is that she understood something that almost no one in her position understands. She understood that you cannot argue a nation out of its anger. You cannot debate your way back into a country's good graces. Every time you protest, you remind people of the accusation. Every time you defend yourself, you keep the wound open. So she did the opposite of what instinct demands. She said nothing. She fought nothing. She simply outlasted the hatred. She let time do the work that words never could, and she filled that time not with self-pity or complaint, but with quiet, relentless, dignified consistency. While the public waited for her to stumble, to lash out, to reveal the villain they were certain lurked beneath the surface, she gave them nothing to hate. No scandal, no drama, no missteps. Just year after year of showing up, doing the work, and staying calm. And slowly, the story the public had written about her ran out of fuel. You cannot hate a ghost. And for years, that is essentially what Camilla made herself. A quiet, steady, unremarkable presence who refused to give the fury anything to feed on. There was something almost unsettling about how effective it was. Because in the end, Camilla did not win the public over with a grand gesture or a dramatic redemption. She won by attrition. She won by being patient in a world that rewards impatience. She won by understanding that in the long war for public opinion, the person who refuses to fight, who simply endures, who waits with infinite patience while everyone else burns out their anger, is often the one left standing at the end. And think about the discipline that required. 20 years of it, 2 decades of showing up, of holding her tongue, of never once taking the bait when the press baited her, of never once demanding the recognition she must have wanted. Imagine being blamed by an entire nation for the unhappiness of its most beloved figure and choosing, day after day, year after year, to simply absorb it in silence and keep working. Most people could not sustain that for a month. She sustained it for 20 years. And that, more than any single event, is the real engine of this transformation. Not luck, not a single lucky break or a change in the headlines, but an almost superhuman patience, applied relentlessly until the impossible slowly became inevitable. And that is the part that should genuinely make you stop and think, because the crown Camilla wears today was never handed to her. No one woke up one morning and decided she deserved it. There was no moment of collective forgiveness, no grand act of national reconciliation. Instead, over the course of more than 2 decades, she, quietly, patiently, and with extraordinary discipline, dismantled the version of herself that the public had built and replaced it with another. Piece by piece, year by year, until the old story simply could not stand anymore. She did not seize the throne. She did not demand it. She did something far more remarkable and, in its own way, far more formidable. She waited for it. She outlasted every person who swore it would never happen. She let a grieving, furious nation exhaust its anger against her, and she stood unmoving until that anger had nowhere left to go. And when the dust finally settled, decades later, there she was, still standing, still calm, still patient, ready to step into a role that the entire country had once sworn she would never be allowed to touch. That is how the most hated woman in Britain became its queen. Not by fighting the story the world told about her, but by patiently, silently, and completely erasing it, and writing a new one in its place. A throne that no one gave her. A throne she simply, quietly took. And by the time anyone realized what had happened, the crown was already on her head. And the woman the nation once threw bread rolls at was Queen of the United Kingdom. The question worth sitting with is this. Was it manipulation? A cold and calculated campaign to launder a reputation that perhaps did not deserve saving? Or was it something closer to redemption? The story of a woman who genuinely loved a man, endured decades of public humiliation for it, and earned her place through sheer, quiet persistence? The truth as it so often is, probably lives somewhere in between. But whichever version you believe, one fact is beyond dispute. What Camilla accomplished, the sheer scale of the reversal, the patience it required, the discipline it demanded, is one of the most remarkable transformations the British monarchy has ever seen. And it happened so slowly, so quietly, that most of the world never even saw it coming until it was already complete.